So, hi, Abby. Thank you so much for coming to Smith. I'm really excited to hear your lecture tonight and to have this opportunity to talk with you now. And I know your body of research really well, but I'm wondering if you could tell everyone who will be watching this interview a little bit about your area of research and your interests, and maybe even some of your major findings.
So generally speaking, my research focuses on understudied families, and the way that I've kind of conceptualized my body of work is really looking at families that have been either invisible or underserved. So I've done work on invisible sexual minority women, namely bisexual women partnered with men. I've done work now recently on gender nonconforming or gender queer college students who tend to be either sort of subsumed under transgender college students or just ignored completely. And then I've done quite a bit of work on lesbian and gay parents, and specifically adoptive parents, who up until 10 years ago, which I'll talk about, were really not the focus of any research at all. So I've been following that particular group, the adoptive parents, for over 10 years. In terms of major findings, not surprising to me, we found that family structure is really not a kind of key variable in determining family outcomes. So lesbian parent families, gay parent families, and heterosexual parent families have far more in common than they actually sort of look different. So rather, family process variables are more important in determining child and family outcomes. So things like level of education of the parents, parental depression, how old the child was at the age of adoption. That has a lot more implications for how families are doing than whether they're a gay parent family or a lesbian parent family.
One of the things I was really interested in as I was reading what you and other folks have written is that historically a lot of the research on LGBTQ families was, I think, what you talked about as being defensive, in that it was really aimed at sort of making that case, or it looked like it was aimed at making that case that children in LGBTQ families do as well or better than children in heterosexual families. And that now the research all of a sudden is starting to sort of move beyond that child level outcome piece. And I'm wondering sort of about, what you think about in terms of your own research with regard to social justice and a social justice mission and how that impacts your work.
Yeah. Well, the early work really was very important, I will say, in terms of just establishing that sort of as the finding that I just talked about, that in fact family structure, whether your parents are lesbian or gay or heterosexual, is not actually relevant to your ability to parent. So sexual orientation should not be considered a relevant indicator of parental ability. And we really needed those studies because in the early 70s, there were lesbian identified women who were losing custody to their heterosexual ex-husbands. And so a group of scholars knew that it was really important to start to do some preliminary research to try to establish that, in fact, being a lesbian mom, does not necessarily, is not a bad thing, and it's not going to have detrimental effects on a child. So we were able to establish that, and now there's really room to kind of move on past that very basic question of does growing up in a lesbian parent family, scar you for life? Like we know that that's not true. So now we can ask more interesting questions. So in my work, of course, it's social justice oriented in terms of how I frame my questions. Obviously, in terms of how I interpret my findings. So I would never say, I don't think most serious social scientists would ever say that their work is, objective in kind of the literal sense, that we're all bringing a lens to our work. And so certainly I approach my work with a particular set of interests, questions, assumptions. And so, the questions that I ask, I don't ask, how are children in lesbian and gay parent families different than children in heterosexual parent families? I ask about sort of something a little bit more broader and more nuanced. What are the unique strengths that these children show, for example? I don't ask, are children of lesbian and gay parents more likely to be teased? I sort of want to understand, under what conditions are they more likely to experience teasing? And in interpreting a finding, like maybe they are more likely to be teased, I don't assume that that's it's clearly bad for children to be raised in lesbian and gay parent families. I don't pin the problem on the parents. I pin the problem on society. So if we do find that children are more likely to be teased, that's a problem with homophobia. That's not a problem of parents.
So you're really thinking about how those findings are going to be used in the media or in other settings.
Absolutely, yeah.
And at the same time, if I find that children are more likely to be teased, that's a finding. So I may not like it. I mean, it may not be what I hope to find, but it is what it is. And so it's up to me and, the other people working with me to try to understand that and put it in a context that can inform, social policy, public policy, and so on.
So you were talking about sort of where the research has been and sort of now where it's moving. What do you think are the really new and exciting sort of frontiers of queer family research?
Well, we've gotten to the point where we think we're less afraid of asking some interesting and sometimes tough questions. For example, it's important to look at the sort of aspects of family life that are not as maybe pleasant. Intimate partner violence, for example, in lesbian or gay parent families, how might that be experienced differently? Are the supports and resources needed for parents in those situations adequate, or are they largely heteronormative? What's the experience, for example, of transgender kids with lesbian or gay parents, right? That may be a small number, but that's certainly a unique sort of context to grow up as a trans kid, and likewise to be a lesbian or gay parent parenting a trans child. So looking kind of within some of the more complicated and sometimes difficult topics, I think, is really, really important. Likewise, there's been really an assumption of monogamy in a lot of relationship research, and so looking at polyamorous parent family, poly families, I think is an important area, and there are a few scholars who've done some work in that area.
And I've noticed that your work is sort of moving also. You were talking about the study that it sounds like is already underway about gender nonconforming college students. I'm curious what other projects you're sort of have in the works at this point.
Yeah, that is an exciting study because it really came out of work with students. So really teaching and working with, as research assistants, a lot of students who were trans or gender nonconforming, and really talking to them made me realize the ways in which, even at Clark University, which is a very, I think, queer and trans sensitive school in many ways, there were still ways in which those students were not being, I think, adequately served. And so we started running focus groups, and I had some more formal interviews with students to kind of inform the development of the survey, which we're now launching. So that's one project. And then another project is a study of bisexual women partnered with men who are pregnant and having a child. And so that study really focuses on the ways in which those women's identities and sexualities are often invisibilized and marginalized. Most people, when they go to their primary care doc or perinatal health care provider, if they're with a male partner, a woman with a male partner who's pregnant is assumed to be straight. So all the women in our study are women who've had sexual relationships with women in the last 5 years. So these are recent and sometimes salient for them, but nobody's asking them about them. So as they become parents, we're interested in sort of how their lives become more heteronormative, kind of more, it becomes maybe harder to disclose a bisexual or non-heterosexual identity, and looking kind of over time at how they might look different than their parents in terms of how they raise their children, their parenting values, and so on.
It sounds like some of that is looking at external systems too, like the healthcare system and how it responds or interacts with those women.
Yeah, I'm very interested in healthcare, schools, the legal system, all of the big contexts that affect families' lives.
So speaking of big contexts that affect family lives, we're living in a time where the policy context for same-sex families in particular is dramatically changing, and also where there's been really discriminatory legislation that affects trans and gender nonconforming folks as well, or people who identify as trans or gender nonconforming. And I'm curious what you think the next frontiers for policy and civil rights work in these areas are.
I think a huge one is employment non-discrimination laws, which seem to have a very hard time really sort of moving forward. Obviously, that affects everybody. It affects LGBTQ employees, it affects their children, it affects their families. If people can't be certain that they're not going to lose their job because of a gender transition, for example, or their sexual orientation. So that's super important. I tend to be very interested in thinking about schools and children, and so there's many barriers to this, but sort of more formalized efforts to ensure that children are taught about all different kinds of family structures, sexual diversity, gender diversity, I think would go a really long way in helping to minimize and kind of take root of the kind of homophobia that, of course, starts to develop when children are really young. So there's all kinds of barriers to that. But generally speaking, I think programs that really affect children could go a long way.
Probably most of our folks who are going to be viewing this video are practitioners who are out in the field. And sort of for you, are there things about your research you would want them to know as they're thinking about practice, particularly with children and families?
I think it comes down to not making assumptions about the people that you're working with. It's something that comes up a lot in our bisexual women study, that people often make assumptions about who they are, what their history is, or what kind of even if somebody finds out they're bisexual, oh, there's a host of assumptions that go along with that. So it's important for families and children that practitioners are never making assumptions. As an example, I have worked with a lot of kids with LGBT parents, and when a kid goes to therapy, usually they're asked, so tell me about your mom and your dad. So for a kid with queer parents, that's instantly a way in which they're being marginalized. So even just not making the assumption that the people that you're working with have two parents, have a mom and a dad, who knows, that kid could have, be from a very complicated family structure. They could be part of a poly family structure. They could have an active donor dad. There's so many different situations that could come up. So not making those assumptions, letting children, letting families tell you their stories, finding out what language they prefer, what words they use, what names they use, what pronouns, all that is letting people speak for themselves as opposed to making assumptions.
So I teach research at Smith, and one of the things we talk about a lot is how researchers' identities or a researcher's lens might impact their work. And I'm curious what your thoughts are about that in terms of your own work and work in this field in general.
Yeah, I think about it as kind of akin to kind of therapy, is that, obviously you're not going to share all of your identities with your clients. So, that doesn't mean that you can't form a really good rapport and a good relationship with research participants. I think it's important to maybe capitalize on the commonalities that you do share, but not sort of make them the forefront, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So it can be really helpful, for example, if I'm talking to a research participant and they're telling me a funny parenting anecdote, that I can laugh and share something similar. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, some of my graduate students are not parents, and so that doesn't preclude them from being able to also laugh and offer something funny about maybe their own childhood or something that they've observed in children that they know, or family members. I think, of course, if you're researching a population that is different from you and perhaps marginalized, it's really important that you establish your participants as the experts, and you let them know that you're really there to learn from them. Mm-hmm. So I sort of think of myself as kind of the microphone or the megaphone. Like, you're the expert, you're talking, and I'm hopefully going to make your voices louder and package them in some way that's going to be meaningful and helpful. But I'm the storyteller. Like, you're the people. I'm the sort of the person who's I'm like the editor. You're the storyteller, if that makes sense. And so really being curious and really asking questions and letting people be the experts of their own stories. And if it's a population you're not knowledgeable about, making sure you have insiders who can, read your research questions, do some focus groups, do some sort of practice interviews with people who are sort of members of the population that you want to study. Before I launched my study of trans college students, I had many college students complete the survey, give me feedback. I had many trans scholars look at the survey, give me feedback, and I wanted to feel like I was absolutely in a position to feel good and comfortable putting this out into the world. And I'm really happy that I did that, because that hard work did pay off, and we're getting feedback like, wow, this survey is so affirming. I haven't felt misgendered or marginalized, and that it makes me feel so good. I mean, I would feel horrible if I was somehow putting out a product that was not sensitive in some way. So I think just making sure that you do due diligence to talk to people who really do know and are insiders, if you're not.
And sort of on that note, in terms of thinking about research advice, you have doc students I know that work with you, but also thinking about Ph.D. students at Smith or who might see this video. Do you have sort of dissertation ideas or things that you think that doctoral students could be asking and answering that would be helpful to the body of research?
I mean, I think intersectionality is sort of a very broad topic, but it kind of covers, I think, all of the really nuanced areas that I think could be really fruitful to study. So looking at, racial minority, lesbian and gay parents, for example, that's an area that has not been studied. Looking at people who have sexual orientations or identities that are marginalized, who also occupy other marginalized identities, such as people with invisible and visible disabilities. So there's actually not a great kind of emergence of disability studies and kind of queer parenting studies. So that would be, I think, really, really fruitful as well. So I think there's just a lot of depth and nuance and kind of crossing of identities that have just not been explored at all.
Thank you so much for your time today and for coming to Smith. I know that the community is very excited to hear the lecture tonight, and we really appreciate your time.
Thank you.